Okay, I think it's probably a good time to start. So, welcome to this online webinar on trans lived experiences and data from the Celebrating Diversity SIG and the rainbowR group. I just want to say, because this is a live stream, sometimes things don't look right, sometimes things don't sound right. So, please let us know if that's the case. Um, so, thank you so much for choosing to come and spend your evening with us. I'm sure lots of you are probably interested in data anyway, but it does mean a lot to have people come along to this topic, especially given the current climate. So my name is Liam Briley. I'm one of the committee members of the Celebrating Diversity Special Interest Group of the Royal Statistical Society. If you haven't heard of us, briefly, we aim to inform, connect, engage with, and ultimately support everyone in our diverse community of statisticians. And our past events have included career advice for female statisticians, exploration of challenges that neurodiverse statisticians face. And our next event after this in January is actually going to focus on accessibility in communicating stats. And this event is also brought to you by rainbowR. And I'm just going to pass to Rhiann Davies from rainbowR to tell you a little bit about who they are.
Thanks, Liam. Hi. My name's Rhiann. I'm part of the leadership team for rainbowR. We're a community of R users who identify as LGBTQ+. And we've got some Python users hiding in our community as well. So our aim is to connect, support, and promote LGBTQ people in the R community, and also spread awareness of those issues through data-driven activism. The kind of things that we do, we have monthly meetups for our community, which provides a safe space to share sort of R coding that you're working on, share your favorite packages, or just ask for help. We run book clubs. So last year we read Kevin Guyan's Queer Data book. So that was really interesting. We have a buddy scheme where we pair you up with someone else in the community so you can get to know each other a bit better. We manage queer data sets on our GitHub repository. And most excitingly, we've got a conference coming up. So in February, 25th and 26th of February 2026, we've got a rainbowR conference, which is free and online, and the call for abstracts is open now. So I'll pop some of those links in the chat. I think that's everything. If you want to know more, head to rainbowR.org.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's event, and just a brief reminder of the RSS event conduct policy. So we're going to hold any discussion and interaction with our speakers and each other respectfully when we engage. And just finally, why are we running this event? So the past 7 days have been Trans Awareness Week, which is an international week dedicated to education about the lives of and advocacy for the rights of transgender people against the many barriers that they face in access to healthcare, in discriminatory policies, and in their vulnerability to harassment, hate, and violence. And tomorrow, 20th of November, is Transgender Day of Remembrance. And this was first founded to commemorate the life of Rita Hester, a trans woman who was murdered in Boston in 1998 simply because of who she was. And she was 34 years old. And sadly, Rita is far from the only victim of transphobic violence. And on the 20th of November every year, we remember all trans people who were taken from us too soon. Memorials and vigils will be happening all across the UK and very much beyond. So I would encourage you to consider attending a local event, even if you haven't personally lost someone, if nothing else, for the memory of Rita. And with that, I'm now going to move on to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Matthew Voigt. So if you have any questions for our speakers throughout, then please do put them in the chat, and there'll be an opportunity for us to direct them to the speakers afterwards. But Dr. Voigt is assistant professor in the program in mathematics education at Michigan State University. His research interest examines issues of equity and inclusion in undergraduate STEM education, and he is a proud first-generation queer researcher. And he is going to speak about gender and sexuality in STEM education. So I'm going to pass over to you, Matt.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Liam, and thank you everyone for having me here. 1 second to get my slides up. All right. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the studies I've done looking at gender and sexuality in tertiary or undergraduate STEM education. And I'm going to cover 6 talks in 20 to 25 minutes. So this is going to be a lightning talk, but the hope is that it will give a little glimpse into some of the research that we know about, and also to invite people for future research, as I have a captive audience of people who know statistics and data. So a little bit about the problem and context, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is that STEM fields, particularly mathematics, disproportionately filter out students with marginalized identities. And so why did I come to this research, or why might someone research the area of gender and sexuality in STEM education? There are metaphors of the STEM pipeline being leaky or even pushing people out. And so we see high achieving students with minoritized identities are more likely to leave STEM. There's well-documented evidence in the US and globally that there are these gendered and racialized discourses, that mathematics is often framed as a white, masculine, and individualistic domain. Yet there's a gap in the data researching queer spectrum or LGBTQIA students and their experiences in mathematics and STEM broadly. And so as a researcher, my goal is really to understand what queer students' experiences are from a quantitative perspective, and I'll also share sort of how they navigate them in a qualitative view. And so briefly, some of the theoretical foundations or the lenses that I draw on, one being intersectionality theory, so recognizing that there are interrelated forms of oppression that are impacting people, and we can't just look at gender or race alone, or gender and sexuality, and so we need to attend to both. Critical discourses, so I draw often on queer theory or feminist theory to try to problematize oppressive structures and to highlight power dynamics that are occurring to marginalize certain populations. And then I'll also talk about Nasir's identity resources. And these are resources that help support one's math identity or STEM identity. And so I'll talk about those a little later. Okay, so first, part 1, some of the quantitative insights that we've gained to learn about how queer spectrum students experience mathematics. And so the data here comes from a large-scale data set of roughly 30,000 student responses. And these were surveys that were administered in pre-calculus, Calculus 1 or Calculus 2 courses across 21 universities in the United States. And it's a really powerful data set because it's rather large and pretty comprehensive. So we asked students about what was happening in the classroom, homework practices, as well as comprehensive and open-ended demographic information. Okay, and so from the data set, we grouped variables along some outcome variables, which I'll talk about. I won't go into too many details, but some of them look at instructor interactions, so how the degree to which students are interacting with their instructor. Same with peer interactions, how are they interacting with other peers in the classroom. The reported sense of community and participation, as well as how responsive the instructional environment is to their needs. Are there multiple representations, graphs, tables, other ways in which to accommodate their learning needs? And then positive math affect, which is one's interest, enjoyment, confidence, and their sense of ability to do mathematics. So these are the sort of primary outcome variables that we were looking at from our survey data. And so the first study that I'll share was really looking at sexuality and how queer spectrum students experience the math classroom. And so one thing that we saw was that there were statistical differences between asexual students and those who reported being queer or bisexual, specifically along instructor interactions, peer interactions, and their sense of community, as well as their positive math affect. And so we're seeing these differences that were significant based on our post hoc tests. And to interpret what some of these might mean, or what we put meaning to, is that asexual students are reporting higher levels of peer interactions, greater sense of community, more interactions with their instructors and peers. And we hypothesize that this may align with the sort of the problematic nature of math being identity neutral or sort of assumed heteronormative within mathematics. And so asexual being a less visible or less conflicting identity may mean that their identity is aligned with the discourses that appear within mathematics. Alternatively, bisexual or queer students are reporting these lower levels of interactions and sense of community, which may suggest this sort of misalignment between their, okay, Google Drive, let's keep it together. Between the sort of binary logics that are present in mathematics. And so there may be conflict that is existing within their identity and some of the norms and discourses that are prevalent within mathematics. Okay. And so our second study, we then decided to take an intersectional analysis looking at race and gender to understand how students were experiencing the mathematics and specifically the instructional practices that were occurring. And so our outcome variable of interest here was really math affect. So again, one's confidence, interest, enjoyment, and their sense of ability from the beginning and the end of the term. And then looking at the sort of reported instructional practices. And because we had such a large data set, we were able to examine based on gender as well as racial breakdowns. So we were able to look at cisgender men, cisgender women, as well as transgender and gender non-conforming students based on just the number of responses that we had. And so one of the key findings that we developed was that when these high instructional practices were present along all of the instructional practices, so mathematical engagement, collaboration, the instructor inquiring into students' thinking, and participation, when all four of these were high levels, they were beneficial for all gender and race groups. And so you can see here, these sort of red dots here are the groups that we sort of broke apart that were reporting high levels. And those all have sort of positive slopes, indicating that when those are present, their math affect was increasing. And their math engagement tended to have the largest impact on their increase in their math affect. But these trends were not universal for all students. So for instance, if we look at the students who reported as transgender or gender nonconforming, we do see that there is a positive impact on mathematical engagement in terms of their effect on their math affect. But we see differing levels of how that may impact students based on their collaboration, instructor inquiry, or the level of participation or community that they sensed within the classroom. So for instance, Asian transgender and gender nonconforming students had sort of an opposite impact from instructor inquiry and participation compared to Hispanic or multiracial students. And then another thing that we did within this data was to try to humanize the data because when we present some of these statistical models, we lose the humanity of it. And so one thing we also tried to do was then to highlight open-ended student responses along with their actual Likert style responses. And so you can see here from a Filipino gender flux student in calculus, while their math affect increased, they said, I haven't seen much of an impact on my identity and how I've experienced mathematics in my classroom. However, I've noticed that outside the classroom, older students are tentative to accept or ask for my help that I'm confident on, opting instead to ask their peers who are also unsure. And so we know that our survey responses are not capturing the totality of students' experiences. And so we need to investigate sort of why these impacts may be happening. And so one thing we took away from this study was that not all practices were equal. So while the presence of all four of them tended to be positive, when we break down on what instructional practices are used, they're not benefiting every group in a sort of monolithic way. And so when people say, active learning is good for all students, we're sort of problematizing that may not be true. So another example we saw was with peer collaboration, when Indigenous cis men who were Alaskan Native or Native American, we saw actually a negative impact for their reported levels of peer collaboration, whereas Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander cis men reported positive impacts on their math affect when peer collaboration was present. suggesting that this needs to be dug into further, that there may be cultural differences or different ways they're interacting with their peers or instructors. So this tells us, that there are findings or there are differences, but it doesn't really explain the sort of why or how behind the numbers. And so some of the data that I'm going to share now is really sort of the stories or the sort of qualitative findings that we've seen within the research that we've done. And so the third study that I'll look at is, what are the sort of discourses that queer students have about their identity? And by discourses, I mean these sort of big D discourses, these sort of regimes of truth. One might refer to as like stereotypes. We see in the US that there are discourses about women and students of color not being as mathematically capable. It's not true, but those are discourses that are entrenched within politics, within tracking, within testing. But it's unclear what maybe the discourses are related to queer students. And so based on interviews with 17 queer spectrum students, we did multiple interviews with them. We identified these sort of 7 prominent discourses that they shared and how their queer identity was positioned within mathematical environments. And we ranked those on how it was excluding or including their queer identity within those spaces. And so the most exclusionary was this sort of marginalized discourse. Here, students were talking about how their queer identity was just discriminated against. There was overt hostility. They could not be present in those spaces without experiencing that hostility. Then you move to a more erasure discourse. And this erasure discourse is really the sort of implicit or intentional pressure to erase or silence queerness in mathematics. So don't talk about this here. Why are you talking about your sexuality? It's these pressures to sort of cover up one's queerness as not being relevant. The heteronormative discourse is sort of similar, but here it's just everyone assumes everyone is straight, right? We're in a math class. It's heteronormative. I'm just going to look around and see a bunch of straight white men and assume everyone here is straight. So it's less about the pressure to silence it versus the assumption that there just aren't queer people in these spaces. As we get to more inclusionary discourses, students talked about sort of ambiguous. They weren't sure where it was. A normalized discourse where they talked about my queer identity is the same or treated the same as straight identity, but both kind of don't matter to pursuing mathematics or mathematical spaces. And then an accepted discourse where it's actually overt or explicit messages about queerness or queer people being accepted within mathematics. And sort of one added layer was the sort of valued discourse, where not only was it accepted, but it was seen as an asset. So because I'm a queer person and I see the world differently, I have to orient to the world differently. That gives me new insights and values that I can leverage to mathematics. I can think of things in different ways in the math classroom. And so we organize these discourses, again, based on their level of exclusion and inclusion, but also the messages they talked about in terms of whether their queer identity was relevant or irrelevant. And you see here sort of the erasure discourse, right? It's exclusionary, but the main message here is really that it's irrelevant. That's the force that acts upon it to cast it as don't talk about this here. And so this sort of theory building endeavor resulted in this plane in which we looked at across all these interviews, we saw 434 sort of coded instances of the discourses. And what we see is that over 74% of the discourses were exclusionary in nature. So they were the marginalized, the heteronormative, the erasure discourses. And this presents the sort of paradox of neutrality. So Martha, one of the students was quoted, says, I'm in a calculus class and we just talk about calculus. It's not relevant there, right? So this paradox here is that math is treated as this neutral subject, sort of neutral in that anything could be added to it, except for sexuality, right? We can't bring that in there. And so there's a sort of paradox of neutrality here experienced by queer students. And so one of our main findings is that for queerness, it's not about success in the same way that those success discourses are tied to women and students of color. It's about rightful presence for queer students. And so we hypothesize that because queer identity may be less visible, the same power structures at play that exclude women and students of color through tracking, through microaggressions, through other sort of marginalizing impacts can't be asserted in the same ways. And so instead, the pressure here is to deem it as irrelevant, to try to erase it, to not talk about it. And so here, really, the discourse is about presence for queer students. Okay. Our fourth study then was looking at students are experiencing these marginalizing discourses. They may be exclusionary. And so how do they navigate that within a math or STEM space? And so we conducted interviews with 11 students, and we actually had them place themselves on this plane that we had built to how excluded or included they felt and how relevant or irrelevant they felt their identity was in particular spaces. And the spaces we asked about was just sort of generally how they felt. In STEM classrooms, did they feel relevant, included? In non-STEM classrooms, and then in lab spaces. And so we had these semi-structured interviews in which they placed themselves on this plane and then talked about why they placed it in the locations they did. And so when we group all those 11 together, you'll see here sort of this was the area in which all of the points occurred for generally. And so you see students generally say, well, they feel their identity is included and sort of relevant to their lives. Then we start transitioning into STEM spaces, this sort of yellow box here, and you'll see it's a bigger space and it starts shifting over into being excluded and more irrelevant. That's what we saw within our theory building and then kind of confirmed it with how students themselves were placing themselves. Now, that stands in contrast to sort of non-STEM courses like arts, humanities, English, where students really talked about they felt included and they felt their identity was more relevant in those spaces. They could talk about it. It was meaningful in those non-STEM courses. And then lastly, you get to lab areas. So these sort of breakout labs or science labs, and students really talked about how they felt it was irrelevant, their queer identity in those spaces. Many of them said, I'm just like a robot. I need to get in. I need to do my things. I need to get out of that lab. And there's sort of this dehumanizing effect as we get more technical and sort of more into the lab areas of doing STEM. Okay. And so one of the things we did then was build this navigational model for how students were talking about these different spaces and their queer identity. And so sort of first what they do is they perform these environmental evaluations. They look around and they say, is this space safe? And some of the cues they turn into is, oh, this room is full of lots of cis-presenting men. And so I, don't feel as safe here. They look for queer inclusive symbols, pride flags, pronouns, as well as sort of historical experiences they've had in those environments. And so once they evaluate the environment, they perform some psychological identity calculations, asking what's the relevance, what's the risk benefit? Do I come out to these people? Do I not? Is it going to impact my grade? And they sort of perform these calculations based on the space. And then they do some sort of behavioral action. And their behavioral action might be disclosing their queer identity. It might be what they called shelving their identity, where they didn't feel like they were in the closet or lying, but they're like, I'm not going to disclose this here. Another behavioral action was sort of building a chosen community. And so students talked about surrounding themselves with peers and students who they knew were supportive and sort of building up those chosen communities in the classroom so they felt safer and safer to then perform these environmental evaluations and psychological identity calculations. And so this process becomes cyclical, that students are evaluating the environment, calculating risks, and then making some sort of behavioral action. And if we think about this, this is taking a lot of cognitive effort on the part of queer and trans individuals when they're trying to learn differential equations or integrals, right? And so think about what these students are having to experience on top of learning the content. Okay. And so that really brought us into our fifth study was, well, how can we support one's math identity and queer identity through these identity resources? And so one student, Aiden, said, I don't feel comfortable going to STEM clubs because I don't feel like I fit the math mold. And so here you can see that STEM clubs were not an identity resource for Aiden. So what resources were successful or what weren't? In terms of material resources, some of the physical resources, we saw that smaller safe spaces were deemed more sort of important to affirming their math and queer identity. And these might be sort of LGBT STEM clubs. In the US, we have OSTEM, or sort of out in STEM. Research labs were very important because they could see signage or rainbow flags. And an interesting one that sort of was hostile towards our identity development was the lack of gender-neutral restrooms. So students would point out, oh, there's no gender-inclusive restroom in the engineering building, so clearly I can't be an engineer. Or, oh, the only women's bathroom is in the basement of the math building. And they would cue into this in terms of how they were positioned or treated within those disciplines based on the actual physical buildings. In terms of relational resources, key ones were peers or instructor relationships. Students talked a lot about having study dyads, where they would work with one person who they really developed a relationship with and felt safe and trusted with. In contrast, we see what sort of constrained their identity was a lack of queer faculty. So these visible role models and students really wanting those to feel like they could be a queer person within STEM fields. And then with ideational resources, these are sort of the ideas one has about math and STEM, and these were almost always exclusionary towards supporting one's identity. And that was often because the dominant idea of a math person was, again, this straight white man. Okay, and so our last study was really looking at sort of transgender students and really highlighting what their experience was like. And so we had a study, this is actually combining two studies for this publication, but it was students who had experienced the transition while they were in their undergraduate programs. And so we used this dimensions of gender oppression framework to understand their experiences. And they're sort of broken into two different forms of oppression. One sort of gender category oppression, and this is the sort of bias based on your perceived gender category. So women being sort of marginalized or oppressed in STEM spaces, right? Sort of microaggressed against, versus gender transgression oppression, which is sort of the bias on how well you may conform to the sort of gender norms, right? So a masculine presenting individual who wears a dress might face more gender transgression oppression in those spaces. And one of the quotes that Charles shared, it was a trans man who transitioned in his engineering program, said, "Everyone respects me so much as a man. I could literally be like, gravity is 10 and not 9.8, and people would be like, yeah, that's probably right." And that quote just stuck with me because it just highlights the sort of differential treatment that Charles had after they had transitioned, and the sort of gender marginalization that's occurring within our STEM spaces. And so there's really sort of a paradox of transitioning that we saw within STEM. So for trans men, or Charles' example sort of shows sort of the gained gender category privilege. So they were seen as men, and suddenly they're respected, they're seen as competent, and it sort of confirms the field's male bias. Whereas trans women like Hannah in our study sort of gained gender category oppression, so they were talked over, they were microaggressed, but they sort of lost this gender transgression oppression. They weren't bullied for being feminine anymore. And so what we saw from the stories that they were telling is that for trans women, the relief from this gender dysphoria and not having to perform masculinity outweighed the new sexism they faced in STEM. And so this really, to me, highlights the need to deconstruct these power regimes that are oppressing individuals, both women and trans and non-binary individuals within our STEM spaces. Okay, so that was a hopefully quick overview of the 6 studies so far that we've done, and I'll pull together some of the key takeaways. So one is understanding that these experiences are not monolithic. So lumping together queer students or underrepresented minority students is just really insufficient. We see differences with asexual, bisexual, and trans students having these different experiences within STEM spaces. Furthermore, we see that neutrality is harmful. So this discourse of erasure, sort of believing that identity is irrelevant to math, is actually really a key barrier, not a feature of math being an objective science. We see a lot in education spaces that people say, oh, active learning is great, student-centered learning is great. Yes, but it needs to be present on all forms, and that the individual practices may need to be attended to with an intersectional lens. And last, sort of understanding that these are systemic issues. These are systems at place that our students in and of themselves are having to navigate. And that's taking a lot of cognitive burden, a lot of basically filtering students out of these fields. Okay, so a few implications, sort of moving us from surviving in STEM fields to possibly thriving in STEM fields as queer and trans individuals. For instructors, this is moving beyond this erasure discourse, moving beyond, oh, I don't see race, I don't see gender, I don't see sexuality, and using sort of inclusive practices. So using pronouns, having pride flags or ally signs, challenging the math mold of who is a math person. So thinking about role models and guest speakers, but overall just sort of humanizing the classroom, asking your students how they're doing, making sure that they have emotional support. These are all things I think instructors could do to sort of humanize the math classrooms. For institutions, it's thinking about what are the material resources that you have and how can you support those? So what are the sort of gender neutral restrooms, the clubs, the affiliations that you have, and can you put more resources to those, as well as hiring and promoting diverse faculty? And for researchers, it's thinking about collecting disaggregated data on sexuality and gender and moving beyond this sort of gap gazing, are there differences, are there not, to understanding the sort of how and why students navigate these different systems of oppression. All right. And with that, I thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. That's really interesting. Some really fascinating insights there. I might start with just a question from myself. So you were looking at calculus students in that large survey, right? And the things you mentioned about pure mathematics being very neutral. Would you then expect differences, I guess, with more data science kind of topics, which is still analytical, but it's very much about interpretation and subjective choices?
I mean, that's a great question. I think could be a future research. I think when we get into any of the sciences, I think they're always cast as this sort of rigor producing, this sort of hard science. I think data science falls in that realm as well. And so I think we'd see the same sort of discourses of like, well, no, this is a statistical model. We have faith in our statistical model, right? And it's like, well, yeah, but humans are the one who collected that data. Humans were the one who decided what to model, how to model it. So I think data science being a newer field has the potential for avoiding some of those same pitfalls that math and other sciences have fallen on by trying to really promote the humanizing aspects of the field.
Yes. And I guess I suppose that's kind of a plug in a way for rainbowR, because they do have the queer data repository that is really useful for bringing that to the classroom. There is one question in the chat that I will relay to you. You covered a bit about this at the end there, but maybe you could speak a bit more about it. So what do you think the biggest thing that STEM educators can do? What do you think is the biggest thing that STEM educators can do to make folk of all genders feel welcome and empowered?
I think it's being humble and just understanding that you're going to make mistakes. So I get this a lot from people who aren't within the queer communities of, am I going to say the right thing? Am I going to, offend someone? And I think language evolves and changes so quickly that just having a more humble and humanizing approach and understanding that, using the names that students want to use, modeling those practices, and just, owning those mistakes that you make and say, oh, I'm sorry, and then moving forward with those. I think those are some of the orientations versus people always want, well, give me the list, give me the practices that I need to do. And those are just so always changing and evolving. It's more of a mindset of, I see you as a person and a learner that I can learn from. And I think that's the orientation we need to make with students.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I guess I've got another comment, because I found it really staggering, those experiences that you reported from students who've transitioned, that their university peers are interacting with them in that social role of their post-transition gender, but that's not necessarily a positive given the existing gender disparities in STEM. So is this the case that, we can't kind of start tackling these inequalities without dealing with the wider inequalities that permeate STEM?
Yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's, these are broader societal discourses for how I think trans non-binary women are treated. I think it's because math, science are gatekeepers. They're seen as positions of power, right? That there are these exclusionary forces. So I think we just feel it more so. And people have elevated power in these spaces to be able to push people in or out. And so I think it's, yeah, bringing people together and trying to tackle those systems of oppression through data science, through, using data and evidence to say, hey, look, there are these problems that are occurring. And so what's then the solution? How do we sort of, address these? And it's not the US model of, well, then let's defund everything and not talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's definitely not the way to go.
Yeah. And maybe I'll ask just one more brief last question that might actually lead us nicely into our next talk. But we've had a few RSS Celebrating Diversity events with Kevin Guyan, who's spoken about queer data and how we actually define categories that we might place ourselves into in terms of our own identity. What is your kind of approach when you collect data on identity in terms of queerness? How do you tackle that question of what are the right terms to use? What's going to get me the answers that I want?
Yeah, I think I mean, one, kind of thinking of like, what analysis are you trying to do and why are you collecting that data? I think making sure that you have these open-ended availability, because language changes so quickly and people self-identify in different things. But then I think the pitfall that I see many people in is, oh, well, these are small response numbers, so I'm just going to exclude them from the data. And that's the very definition of erasure, right? Like we're saying, oh, I'm just going to remove you and remove all your humanity because you don't fit into my box. And so then I think it's really sort of, even if our data set may be limited or I want to perform certain statistical tests, how can we rethink of groupings that would allow for that? So for instance, like my queer plus category was a created category of individuals who selected multiple queer identities. Same with sort of straight plus, individuals said, well, straight and bisexual, right? If I would have kept all those apart, I wouldn't have been able to do the same sort of calculations. But I wanted to honor the fact that there were these varied responses. And so I think that's one way to do it. I think another would be to say, there's a small number of responses to this. We'll present some descriptive statistics for this group, and then we'll run our models on this other thing. And so you're not removing them from the analysis and you're still highlighting their lives and their stories. But recognizing some of the limitations you might have in the data analysis that you want to do.
That's a very valid point. Okay, thank you, Matt, and I hope you'll join me in the chat in thanking Matt for giving his time to speak for us. We're now going to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Lexi Webster. So Dr. Webster is Associate Professor of Digital Culture at the University of Southampton, and her research is situated at the intersections of linguistics, digital media, and gender and sexuality studies. And beyond social media linguistics that we'll hear about today, she also has interests in queer-first generative language models and the politics of queer data under techno-capitalism. But for now, I believe you're going to talk a bit about sex data. So I'll pass over to you, Lexi.
Thank you. And thanks, Matt, for that talk as well. It set me up nicely. So hopefully you can see my slides, which should be showing now.
Yeah, all good.
Fantastic. So I've taken a slightly different tack with this talk in that I'm not going to present the findings of research per se. This is more a position or an exposition on how language and data have become inextricable in this age of state-sanctioned transphobia, particularly because I imagine I'm talking to many people who work a lot with data and who will have heard at some point in the past that from other people, oh, I don't know anything about data, so I couldn't comment. Whereas from my experience as a linguist, because everybody has language, whether in speech or in sign or in text comprehension, everyone thinks they're an expert on language. And I think that tackling that relationship between language and data, where they are entirely unremovable from each other, allows us to get to a position within this gender critical era of becoming more data critical. And I think I'm going to end with a provocation that I hope is welcome, but may not be welcome at the end of this talk. So first, and thanks, Liam, for the introduction, just to describe who I am a little bit. So my primary disciplinary training is in linguistics, and I bridge cognitive linguistics and corpus linguistics most often, and more recently engaging in critical data studies. So from working with data to working beyond data. And as a corpus linguist, of course, I work with large-scale data, and I use computational methods to analyze text, and try to infer meaning by applying language theory to what is essentially strings of letters. But in cognitive linguistics, I really explore the relationship between our human experience and how language is a module of the mind, and we cannot remove language from our conceptualization of what it means to think and what it means to be. And this leads to a kind of overarching narrative of my research, which is really about complexity reduction. So in data, presenting work or presenting text in the aggregate in order to reduce its complexity and give some simple numerical outcomes. And in cognitive linguistics, taking the hyper complexity of the world around us and thinking how people make those choices to represent the world based on their needs, their values, their interests. And I'm going to talk a lot about complexity and simplicity over the next few minutes, largely because transphobia is in one way very complex in terms of its social impacts and in terms of its legislative affordances and how politics in the West primarily, but all around the world, enables and allows transphobia, and that is in itself very socially complex. But it's also very simple. It's a simple position taken against a group of people based on an assumption of what categories are supposed to look like and what they don't end up looking like. So I don't really have lots of text on slides. I just have things for you to look at rather than looking at my face, although, I tried. But what I really wanted to talk about is the current situation of the category of woman. And that has become the key talking point in politics and in media discourse currently. It's as much a conflict about data as it is about language, in the sense that categories are linguistic phenomena before they're data phenomena. And when we think about this from a cognitive linguistic perspective, categories require certain conditions. So the way we categorize things in the world around us is to determine a set of sufficient and necessary conditions, whether a bird is feathers or more peripheral to the category. And that's really what the world is currently doing in determining what is the necessary and sufficient condition to being a woman. These definitions can include definitional components. So we might see the refrain adult human female as creating requisite conditions for womanhood. So there are three semantic components to that category. One must be adult, i.e. not child, one must be human, i.e. not animal, and one must be female, i.e. not male. So they all rely on these binary distinctions between what something is and what something isn't in order to create this aggregated meaning and a new category. But they might also be physiological, and I'll talk a little bit more to this fallacy of scientific authority that has come to define or characterize the gender critical position currently. You'll see an interesting graphic representation of gametes on this slide. And of course, the size of our gametes is apparently, according to some sections of the gender critical lobby, is the sufficient or necessary condition to being determined as woman. And I'm using woman very specifically here because female is another category we're going to discuss as part of this talk. But what this definitional or physiological imagination that constructs the category of woman becomes is, in essence, a perfect example of how data and language are tied together. And of course, they have implications that further tie data and language together. Data was the predication for the For Women Scotland case that's caused the uproar in the UK around who counts as a woman under the Equality Act, or what counts as sex under the Equality Act. In essence, it was about how do we count women on boards, who counts as a woman based on the protected characteristic of sex, in order for us to be able to demonstrate or challenge or call for greater sex equity in positions of strategic leadership, or just simply in reporting who is where. And this ties into the same political landscape on particularly the previous Conservative government in the UK, but certainly by no means or no less the current Labour government, this preoccupation with sex data as something that is an inherent need for policymaking. And so Alice Sullivan's review on statistics and research on sex and gender gives us a greater inclination or a greater indication of how sex data has become linguistically enacted as an important resource for politicking, but also for legislation, for health, and for justice. And this is where the language or the critical discourse analysis that I do comes in, around how the discourses of data lead us to the assumption that sex and data are immutable. Both are immutable realities, given their construction when we generate our understanding of what data can be and what sex can be. Sullivan specifically engages in this linguistic entanglement of data, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly. On the more implicit side, of course, we have the proposed or supposed problem of conflation, the idea that sex and gender identity, that language becomes very important in a second, are conflated in the way we do research and the way that we collect data on sex. And that the problem really is that we don't have an outcome for those questions. When we're looking for sex, we know what we're looking for because we can define it in a certain way. But when we're looking for gender identity, or we allow people to respond with gender, then we have this problem of a messy outcome. But explicitly, the Sullivan Review's executive summary says collecting data on sex does not reduce people to biological categories and creates this discursive construction of data as being an entirely neutral thing that is a way of observing a reality beyond a person's understanding of their identity. And that sex is something that, to borrow some terminology from Matt's talk, is irrelevant. It's irrelevant in the sense that it's not contextualized, it's not situated, it's something that exists before our interpretation. But equally, that definition of biological sex, so the construction that sex at birth is something that determines one's legal status or one's biological status within a particular data category, is the neutral observation of somebody's being. The lack of criticality in thinking about data in those senses ignores the circularity of that definition, because sex recorded at birth, sex observed at birth, sex registered or assigned at birth all rely on a human interpreter. There is no mechanism by which certification of a birth or registration of a birth does not require human input to either observe or to interpret or to determine what is sex enough to be either female or male. They also make very specific claims about DSDs, so they create conflations between intersex and disorders of sex development, claiming that they are unusual enough or rare enough, presenting a statistical anomaly, so as not to be useful or necessary in terms of being a problem for data. But they do create distinctions between legal sex and biological sex, although they just use sex to refer to biological sex. And again, this linguistic construction with a pre-modifier enables us to see that they have a particular ideological inclination, not just to understanding sex, but also to understanding the data of sex. They talk about sex data being an inherent good. It's necessary for effective policymaking, particularly in health and justice, for us to determine the sex of a population. And that the assumption around, for example, generating data about gender identity as being useful if necessary creates, again, this construction that data, that tracking, that surveillance is a necessary condition for that effective policymaking. So again, creating categories not just within data, but about data. And that continues quite significantly in the review, particularly in determining sex data as a necessary condition and not requiring justification. Sex data enables effective policymaking. There is never a need to justify the collection of sex data because it should be a general condition of research, particularly when it relates to government doings, so providing health and justice services. However, gender data needs a reason. It's always important to justify why gender identity data need to be collected, particularly in Sullivan's recommendations. And again, this creates a hierarchy of category between sex and gender data, but further constructs this idea that data are themselves effective and data are themselves necessary when we determine what is the good data and what is the superfluous or wouldn't it be nice to have data. So sex is always an important factor. It's also framed as a tool of equality. It always matters what sex is understood to be, but rarely is it important to know how people exist in that sex or experience life in that sex. Because of course, politics is famous for not having any human impact on our lived experience. Sullivan then goes on to create some categories of why gender identity questions might be useful or have been used in the past. And they construct this idea that gender identity questions create this movable tripartite target. One, whether they're understanding the protected category of gender reassignment. Two, that they measure trans identification. Or three, that they measure identification as trans. And they make these very specific linguistic distinctions, but their conceptual distinctions are entirely unclear. Again, the assumption is that the reader knows why data are important and why data need to have particular targets. And I've made similar arguments in the past that we need to disaggregate sex and gender data, particularly when we're talking about language. When I'm talking about the pitch of a voice and the articulation of physiology to produce sound, that's more a sexed phenomenon than a gendered phenomenon in the sense that it relies on a physiological apparatus. But when we're talking about language, when we're talking about identity and the categories of people, we are almost always talking about gender data, because gender is the way that sex is often realized, and our relationship to sex is often realized in the social world. You would think that sociologists would understand that, but apparently they don't. And this leads from the language of data to the data of language. Again, to return to that claim that I made earlier, that people seem to assume a knowledge of language because they have it. It also leads to some rather humorous responses when people create these understandings of language from intuition. The way we talk about sex and gender and sexuality is the precursor to and the outcome of the way we categorize similarity and difference. And the language of sex and gender is rarely a biological phenomenon. Rarely, even when we talk about sex, are we talking about sex. Quite often we're talking about gender. And language makes data a slippery beast. How and why we talk about gender and sex and the data thereon is a particularly difficult task when we don't understand the theory or the science underpinning language. But of course, these scientists know everything. So you can see the fun semantic slips in adult human chicken and why they, them is plural, but an individual should call themselves something else. But equally, if we draw on the data that I've worked on in the past, so from 70 million words of Twitter discourse, when we talk about being trans, we're often not talking about sex, we're often talking about gender. What you can see on the screen is just one screenshot of some data, some characteristic keywords of a trans feminine corpus, where the use of female and transition and hormones are really important, but actually that gender of being trans, of being femme, of being a trans woman are far more prevalent in these discourses. And so there are very few trans people, at least in this Twitter data set, that consider themselves a different sex. Rather, gender is the primary occupation. My own experience then of this super diversity of identities and of the hundreds of categories we might find of identity means that the way we use language to categorize our own identities presents a challenge to what we presume to know and what we presume to be able to distinguish between in terms of these simple nominal categories in order to distinguish who has or who has not, whether that has is a particular genital configuration or not. But also people don't really know what it means to talk about sex and what it means to talk about gender if they aren't inherently understanding the relationship that language has to our experience of the world and how others experience the world. When these constructions of meaning come into play, and the idea that data, categories of sex, categories of female, when they are expanded to include people whose sex was recorded differently at birth, generates this argument of how it detracts from the meaning of being a woman or the experience of being a woman. Again, that inextricability between language and data comes to the fore. When we talk about meaning being diluted, the meaning of womanhood being diluted because a trans woman can also change before she goes to the gym, we are seeing this uncritical understanding of both language and data at work. This is what I really call a simplicity paradigm that negates or obfuscates the complexity of language and human experience, but also reinforces and foregrounds what they presume to be the simplicity of data as a way of ordering the world. Linguistic complexity, as we see in representations of womanhood or ideas of masculinity, reflect the complexity and entanglements of biology and of nominal categories, even if nominal categories are seen as a simplex form of data. By amending meaning, gleaned entirely from a subjective and lived experience, it reduces the experience of a category and somehow detracts from identity. So because because one person, maybe we call them Helen, maybe we call them Alice, has decided what a woman is based on their own experience of a woman, and they've then created these necessary and sufficient conditions for womanhood, everybody else then has to fit her category in order for her to see them as a woman. And of course, our friends are also included in those categories. So if our friends suddenly can't have children, well, having children is now not a necessary condition of being a woman, but producing gametes is. So we have to have had the eggs in the first place, even if we can't reproduce. That's what makes us a woman. And that's also why we count differently, why we must be counted differently, because the service that we ask for or the resources that are offered to us are highly predicated on the sufficient conditions of our gametes. Of course, it matters whether someone produces sperm or they produce eggs in order to have healthcare that looks a certain way. What I wanted to really talk about today was that language and data are mutually constitutive, but they're also mutually constitutive of reality. They exist in this dialectic relationship where one makes the other, and particularly in a world where data is omnipresent and sex and gender are increasingly omnipresent. That reality means that we need to be more critical of data. So how might we engage this simplicity paradigm in order to further the agenda for trans rights? We could co-opt complexity and really lean in to the complex understanding of gender and sexuality we have as queer people, or we could co-opt simplicity and engage instead with basic categories that create a binary, i.e. trans or cis. But we can also complexify those kinds of ideas and simplify those complexities in different ways. We can use data, as we seem to be engaging with a lot, to explain the reality of categories as deployed. So using data, linguistic data, to understand how categories are deployed and used in the real world. Or we can use data to explain the reality of lived experience. So thinking about those critiques, those queer critiques of data, as instead making data fit reality rather than making reality fit data. We could use data to exploit those realities. We could be deceptive in systems, or we could be willingly obfuscating identity or categories in systems. And we could also use data to explode those realities by undermining or destroying the systems that require us to create these categories of ourselves and to discursively construct ourselves within these sex categories. Ultimately, I think we're fighting on contentious battleground, that gender and sex are goalposts that, because they're linguistically slippery, can move and are moved routinely when challenged. Perhaps fighting on the battleground of data and statistics offers us some use from who gets to be a woman and who gets to be female. And rather than amending data or simply critiquing, we can think about unpacking, teaching, and explaining what data really mean in this world. And perhaps in opposition to the gender critical, we can be data critical, and we can start thinking about, this is the provocation, ignore it entirely and stop talking about it. I'm going to end there because I realized that it's at 25 to 7 in the UK and people are probably tired. Thank you.
That was great, though. Thank you, Lexi, and I hope you'll thank Lexi in the chat as well. So I guess I'm trying to formulate my question, but I can't quite formulate it. So I was thinking about, there's clear connections to nuance, and it is very challenging for general public audiences to sometimes grasp nuance, and often we face that in statistics, right? So statistics is often seen as some sort of binary dichotomy. Some research will come out and it will suggest something will happen or it won't happen. And you actually go and read that research, and it's not what the study says, really. The study reports uncertainty around what will and what won't happen. And so I find when I've done public outreach about statistics, I find it really hard to break that idea of this kind of binarizing what is right from wrong. And is there anything you can kind of speak about kind of public perceptions in terms of dichotomies versus nuance?
But I
Oh,
certainly
sorry.
I
Do you want me to repeat it?
I think you asked about the sort of the distinction between dichotomy and nuance.
Yes,
Is that
yes,
right?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
So data are inherently difficult to generate nuance in, not necessarily from, right? Again, we can generate nuance from our interpretations of data, but often those nuances are finite in data because they rely on these often finite categories of adding things together or taking things away or combining in certain ways. Nuance is something that I don't think can be found in data. Because of the way those systems are currently set up and because of our expectations of what data are to look like. I mean, of course, we're talking here about, you know, statistical data and quantitative data. Qualitative data is something that is perhaps different. But I think there is always inherently a dichotomy in our understanding of the world around us. So even when we interpret nuance from data, we're seeing an additive understanding of what is based on what it's not. So even with a branching of it's this, but it's not that. And on top of that, it's this and it's not that, doesn't allow us to actually move beyond what things could be. I don't know if that makes sense because I'm also very tired. But what I mean really is that I think nuance and complexity is a false friend. I don't think that complexity will win us any battles. I think that simplicity is clearly the political weapon of the day, and it has been for a long time, but it's particularly important now. And one thing that I forgot to mention was that the people that propose those arguments are evidently not scared about being wrong. And as statisticians, as data analysts, as data scientists, as linguists, we're terrified of being wrong because we're measured by a different yardstick. Our expertise is something that needs to be reflected in being correct. And these political commentators whose expertise might exist either in disciplines far beyond what they're speaking to or not at all in those disciplines have no worry about being wrong. So maybe if no one's worried about being wrong, we shouldn't be worried about being right, or we should just say, fuck whatever system it is that says that this is wrong, right? But how do we do that in a way that gets people on board?
Yeah. Some valid points there. So sorry, but I might have been echoing there. Am I coming through okay to you now? Okay, well, I'm gonna continue talking, and I will I'll maybe copy the questions in the chat as well, just in case your audio is breaking up. Please let me know if it's happening on YouTube. So, couple slightly more technical questions. So you showed the macro structure of keywords for trans women, but does it look similar for transgender men and non-binary people? And I will copy that question in now.
I basically can't hear you at all now, Liam.
Okay. There we go.
Does the macro structure of keywords look similar for trans men and non-binary people? That's a really good question. Yes, so I couldn't put them all in the slides because I don't like having too many slides. But yes, so there are still those representations of those what we might see as historical categories of transness, the transsexual, right? The MTF, the FTM, those still exist, and people can still call themselves trans male, and they often do. But in terms of the non-binary representation, that becomes more difficult because non-binary is fundamentally a gender term and not really a sex term. Its equivalent in sex and physiology would be something like intersex or non-sexed or asexed, right? And it's not quite, the language isn't there to represent a sex that is not male or female. because again, we've come to understand, in English at least, that there are two sexes. We're a dyadic species, apparently, and that means that you have a sufficient outie and it makes you one thing, and you have a sufficient innie and it makes you another thing. And there isn't really a halfway point, because that is a DSD. It's a disorder of sex development, and that means that you need to be fixed in order to be categorized. It is a reality that changing somebody's physical physiology determines their sex category, and it's only because they're undatifiable that they need to be sexed. The important thing, of course, is determining whether we can put F or M on a piece of paper, which is itself a linguistic practice, to proclaim someone's sex. And of course, if ever anybody makes a mistake and writes M when they mean F, it causes all sorts of problems for record keeping in the future. And marriages have been dissolved between two cis people because of record keeping mistakes like that. But of course, data is neutral and data is objective. And the observation of data by a medical professional must be objective, because medicine is the kind of science where people need to be correct all the time. And we can't possibly abide by a doctor being wrong.
Yep. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If not, we'll go in the chat. It's a long question, so but I will also read it out for the sake of playback. So as a medical doctor, it's useful to be able to factually talk about somebody's body, for example, people with ovaries instead of simply women, but it is becoming needlessly politicized. Obviously, I want to continue being inclusive, but I sometimes simplify my words to make the inclusion more naturally understandable for certain groups of people, e.g. non-trans instead of cis. Does this add to issues on the politicizing of this language, or do you think there's a place for trying to subtly include this kind of language in everyday use?
Cool. So you've asked the question you put in the chat. I have no idea if it's my audio. I don't know what's going on, but you can all hear me, which is good. So that question is a really good one. It is, of course, really useful to be able to talk about organs or parts of the body, right? So it was only last year. I've been on hormones now for 14 years. It was only last year that I was taken off the cervical screening test, and the number of times I've told my doctor that I don't have a cervix, and it's therefore unnecessary for you to be texting me all the time. It is really important. For the most part, I don't think it's necessary to change our language. I think that the unnecessary politicization of these language changes actually leads to a lot more pushback than is necessary. But if we do change the languages, it needs to come with explanation. It can't just be this reification or evidence of a conspiracy that trans people are changing the world, right? This idea that we have to stop, these woke people are telling us that we can't just say woman anymore, or we can't just say breasts, we have to say chest tissue. It has to come with a simple explainer as well. I'm talking about your ovaries, so you know that I'm talking about ovaries. I'm talking about breast tissue because that's what it's called, right? Men have breast tissue, for example. It's there. I think there needs to be explanation. Simplicity without any kind of rationale is where the problem comes in. Equally, it doesn't feel simple to people to change the way they expect to hear their bodies being talked about. There is, of course, the bastardization of feminism in a lot of this argument against it. By calling me a person with ovaries, you are reducing me to my biology. But at the same time, of course, they want to be accepted into the category of sex so that they can piss where they like and they don't have to explain themselves to anybody. So we again have this what we might call nuance, but we're not really calling nuance. We have this problem, this conflict between wanting to be in a category because of one reason, but that reason not being applicable to their understanding of how we categorize other things. Because it's almost like the problem isn't really about how language is used to refer to sex and gender. And it's almost like the problem isn't about the language we use to refer to parts of the body. It's almost like there's some other nefarious reason that they want to create these categories in data. I think medical doctors should use language that is specific to the context at hand, And if we're talking like abstractly about people with ovaries need to be aware of X, or people with prostates need to be aware of X, that's important. If you have a prostate, it's important, not just for trans inclusive practice, but also because being aware of our bodies is really important. Literacy is something that I think is necessary in medicine, in data, in language, in AI. You know, the number of people that keep sending read AI bots to my meetings without understanding what that means is frustrating. So literacy is really, really important, and only with explanation can literacy be developed. Otherwise, it's just knowledge, or it's not even knowledge. It's just sort of a kind of recorded piece of information.
Okay, so we're at 1:45, so we should probably finish, even though there's so much more we could talk about from here. But I want to thank both our speakers, Matt and Lexi, for joining us this evening, and thank you very much for spending your time with us as well. We hope you've had a few things to think about from these talks, and please do look out for our Celebrating Diversity and also the rainbowR events coming up in future. Okay, thanks again. Bye.